What do you mean my name isn't printed a single time? My name is Emily Carter. I am 25 years old. Last November, I sat in a freezing law office in Cheyenne, Wyoming, and listened to an attorney divide up my grandfather's entire life. He read my Aunt Brenda's name. He read my cousin Wyatt's name. They got the cattle herds. They got the Laramie Plains energy leases. They split $2 million in liquid cash. The lawyer flipped to the final page. I waited. He closed the folder. I got 0. Wyatt let out a short laugh. He leaned across the oak table and whispered to his wife about upgrading their ski chalet in Jackson Hole. Before I tell you what happened when the lawyer called me privately with a secret that would tear their new wealth apart, take a second to hit that like button. Subscribe to Olivia Stories Revenge. Drop your age, where you are watching from, and what time it is right now in the comments. Let me take you back to that room. The Chinook winds were rattling the frosted glass windows. Aunt Brenda sat directly across from me. Her hands were scarred and rough from decades of working the ranch. She was twisting my grandfather Dale's heavy silver bolo tie around her fingers. Her knuckles were pale. She stared at me with pure resentment. Brenda stayed in Wyoming. She endured the blizzards to work the dirt. My dad moved away to the city years ago. Brenda always thought my dad was a coward for leaving. Today was her payment for staying. I did not sit there and take it with dignity. I stood up fast. My chair scraped loud against the hardwood floor. I asked the lawyer if there was a typo. My voice cracked. It sounded high and pathetic. Wyatt rolled his eyes. He wore custom leather boots that cost more than my rent. He had not worked a day on the ranch in 10 years. He told me to pack up and go back to my computer screens. I grabbed my winter coat off the back of the chair. My hands were shaking so bad I dropped it on the floor. I bent down to pick it up, hooked my foot on the table leg, and stumbled hard. I caught myself on the doorframe. Nobody helped me. Brenda looked at the wall. Wyatt smirked. The lawyer kept his head down. I walked out into the biting cold. My face burned with shame. I got into my old Subaru. The heater took 10 minutes to warm up. I drove out of the Cheyenne city limits, heading toward the open sagebrush of the Laramie Plains. I gripped the steering wheel until my hands went numb. I hated them. I hated my grandfather for erasing me. Just as I crossed the county line, my phone buzzed on the passenger seat. The caller ID showed Thomas, the estate lawyer. I pulled over onto the gravel shoulder and answered. Thomas did not use his professional courtroom voice. He spoke fast. He asked if anyone was in the car with me. He told me he could not say much over an open line. He said he had something that belonged to me, and I needed to meet him at a diner near the Wind River Reservation immediately. I kept the car running on the gravel shoulder. The wind whipped across the plains, pushing a fine layer of dry snow over the hood of my Subaru. Thomas did not wait for me to speak. He gave me an intersection. State Route 28, just outside the Wind River Reservation. He said to meet him at a diner there in exactly 1 hour and to make sure I was not followed. Then he hung up. I sat there gripping the steering wheel. My chest ached from holding back tears in that law office. A rational person would have turned the car around, driven back to my small Laramie apartment, and tried to forget the Carter family existed. I had a good job writing software for a logistics firm. I paid my own rent. I did not need their money. But the sting of public erasure is hard to swallow. My grandfather had cut me out in front of the 2 people who despised me most. I needed to know why. I put the car in drive. The geography of Wyoming does not offer comfort. It offers isolation. For an hour, I drove through endless stretches of snow-dusted sagebrush and empty freezing basins. The sky turned the color of bruised iron. Cell service dropped to nothing. By the time I saw the flickering neon sign of the diner glowing against the bleak landscape, my hands were stiff with cold. The parking lot was mostly empty, just a few mud-splattered pickup trucks. I walked inside. The air smelled heavy, a mix of stale black coffee and fried bison patties on a flat-top grill. A few locals sat at the counter quiet, wrapped in thick canvas coats. I found Thomas in a back booth away from the windows. He wore a heavy wool jacket over his suit. He looked older than he had an hour ago in Cheyenne. He kept his hands flat on the Formica table. He did not offer me a menu. He did not offer small talk. He slid a thick, sealed manila envelope across the table. He kept his hand resting on top of it. He lowered his voice. He told me Wyatt had not just won the estate. Wyatt was already trying to drain it. Thomas explained that probate in Wyoming takes months, sometimes a year, but Wyatt had just filed an aggressive emergency motion with the court. Wyatt claimed the ranch needed immediate operational funds to survive the winter. He demanded the bank release the $2 million in liquid cash by the end of the week. I frowned. I told Thomas that made no sense. Grandpa Dale always prepaid the winter feed and equipment contracts in October. The ranch operational accounts should have been fully funded until spring. Thomas nodded slowly. He looked over his shoulder toward the diner entrance. He said he knew that, and I knew that, but the court did not. Thomas revealed a piece of context I had missed while away at college. Wyatt ran an exclusive hunting outfitting business up in Jackson Hole. He catered to wealthy tourists buying custom gear, leasing luxury cabins, trying to live like a billionaire. But the word around the local banking circles was that Wyatt was drowning in bad debt. He owed money, a lot of it, and he was desperate. Thomas tapped the envelope. He said he could not legally stop Wyatt's emergency motion without proof of foul play. He said Dale came to his office a month before he died. Dale was paranoid. Dale gave Thomas this envelope and issued strict instructions to hand it to me only after the will reading and only if Wyatt took the bait. I stared at the brown paper. I asked Thomas what was inside. Thomas stood up. He said he did not know, and for his own plausible deniability, he could not know. He warned me to open it in absolute isolation. He dropped a $10 bill on the table for his coffee and walked out into the snow. I took the envelope and hurried back to my car. I locked the doors. The engine was off, and the bitter cold was already seeping through the floorboards. My breath plumed in the freezing air. I ran my thumb under the seal and tore it open. Inside was a heavy metal USB drive and a single piece of lined notebook paper. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was my grandfather's scrawl, shaky from his worsening health, written in thick black ink. The note said, "Wyatt thinks I do not know about the broker. Find the code M." I stared at the words. A broker. Find the code. My heart hammered against my ribs. I closed my eyes, and a memory hit me so hard it stole the breath from my lungs. I was 17 years old. It was a hot July afternoon on the ranch. I was sitting on the wrap-around porch, frustrated, trying to teach my stubborn grandfather how to navigate a new smartphone. He had fat, calloused fingers that kept hitting the wrong buttons. I had sighed and told him he did not need to learn this, that I could just set up his email for him. I told him I was learning to write code, and machines were easier to understand than people. He had stopped tapping the screen. He reached over and grabbed my hand. His grip was rough like sandpaper. He looked at me with those sharp, unyielding eyes. He grumbled, "The people who control the land control the state M. But the people who control the code control the future." At the time, I thought it was just a grumpy old cowboy trying to sound profound. But sitting in my freezing car 8 years later, I realized it was a confession. He knew my skills were not a waste of time. While Aunt Brenda and Wyatt mocked me for leaving the ranch to study software engineering, Dale had recognized exactly what I was building. He knew I understood digital architecture. He had trusted me with this. I pulled my laptop from my backpack and set it on the passenger seat. I booted it up. My fingers were stiff, but I plugged the metal USB drive into the port. The screen flashed black. A command line terminal opened automatically. It was a digital ledger key, highly encrypted. Lines of code scrolled rapidly down the screen, searching for a network connection. Then the scrolling stopped. A red error message blinked in the center of the black terminal. Authentication failed. Local network handshake required. IP mismatch. I stared at the error. My stomach dropped. I knew exactly what that meant. I write security protocols for a living. This USB drive was geofenced. It was tethered to a specific physical location. The encryption key required a ping from a specific local area network to unlock the files. It required the Wi-Fi router sitting on the desk in Grandpa Dale's back office. I could not hack this from my apartment in Laramie. I could not bypass it from a diner parking lot. If I wanted to see what Dale had hidden, if I wanted to find out what broker Wyatt was using to steal the estate, I had to physically connect my computer to the ranch network. I had to go back to the exact property I had just been banished from. I had to walk straight into Wyatt and Brenda's territory. If a deceased relative left you a cryptic task that required facing the very abusers who just erased you, would you walk away to keep your peace, or would you dig deeper and risk everything? I drove the rest of the way to Laramie in total silence. The heater in my Subaru barely fought off the chill settling into my bones. The drive felt longer than usual, the familiar stretches of highway offering no comfort. I carried my laptop and the metal USB drive up 3 flights of stairs to my cramped apartment. It was a small, functional space. The walls were thin, and the radiator clanked a steady, irritating rhythm every 20 minutes. It was a far cry from the sprawling acreage and vaulted ceilings of the Carter Ranch, but it was mine. I paid for it by writing logistics software, not by selling off cattle. I set the drive on my kitchen counter and stared at it. The blinking cursor from the terminal window burned in my mind. Authentication failed. Local network handshake required. My grandfather had left me a digital vault, but he locked the only door inside the very house I was just kicked out of. I paced the narrow strip of linoleum between my sink and my sofa. My anxiety spiked, making my chest tight. I had to go back. I had to walk into the lion's den, but I could not just knock on the front door. Aunt Brenda would shut it in my face before I could even speak. Wyatt would probably call the local sheriff to have me arrested for trespassing. I needed to know exactly what I was walking into before I made a move. The next morning, I drove out to County Road 12. It was a rough dirt stretch that ran along the elevated ridge overlooking the Carter property. I parked behind a thick cluster of windbreak pines, keeping my car out of sight from the main house windows. The Wyoming sky was a pale, cloudless blue, making the fresh snow on the plains blindingly bright. I grabbed a pair of binoculars I kept in my glove compartment for hiking and rolled down the window. The biting air rushed in, stinging my cheeks. I focused the lenses on the main driveway. I expected to see Wyatt celebrating his newfound wealth. I expected to see him loading up his luxury truck for that Jackson Hole ski trip he bragged about at the law office. I expected to see the smug victor. Instead, I saw a man drowning. Wyatt was pacing the gravel turnaround near the main barn. He held a cell phone tight against his ear. Even from a distance, I could read the sheer panic in his posture. His shoulders were hunched forward. His free hand ran through his hair, gripping the roots tight. He was yelling into the receiver, his breath pluming in the cold air, but there was no arrogance left in his movements. He dropped a thick stack of envelopes on the hood of his truck, past due notices. The bright red ink on the paper was visible even through the binoculars. He leaned heavily against the chrome grille of his truck, looking physically exhausted. The custom leather boots he wore the day before were scuffed and caked in freezing mud. Wyatt was not some calculated criminal mastermind sitting in a leather chair counting his stolen money. He was terrified. I realized in that moment that he was not trying to destroy the Carter name out of malice. He was trying to save the legacy, and he was failing miserably. His exclusive outfitting business had bled his finances dry, and now he was dragging the family ranch down into the mud to cover his tracks. I moved the binoculars past the barn, scanning the western property line. Something metallic caught my eye. Parked just beyond our fence line on the adjacent tract of federal land was a fleet of pristine white trucks. They were not standard ranch vehicles or local utility trucks. They were heavy-duty engineering rigs equipped with top-tier topographical equipment. Men in hard hats and high-visibility jackets were planting marker flags in the frozen dirt measuring the basin. Surveyors. Those trucks cost more than our entire cattle herd combined. Corporate developers did not send hardware like that out to the middle of the empty plains to count sagebrush. They were mapping the terrain for something huge. Wyatt had to know they were there. He was leveraging our energy leases right next door to whatever multi-million-dollar project those surveyors were prepping. The pieces were starting to connect in my mind, but I needed the actual data on that USB drive to prove it. I lowered the binoculars and rolled up the window. I had my confirmation. Wyatt was backed into a legal and financial corner, which meant he would be distracted. I just needed an opening to get inside Dale's back office unnoticed. Then I remembered the calendar. Tomorrow was Friday. In Wyoming, when a prominent rancher passes away, the family does not just hold a quiet funeral. They host a chuck wagon memorial dinner. It is a tradition rooted deep in the state's culture, a way to honor the dead by feeding the living. Neighbors' ranch hands and local business owners gather to eat, drink, and share stories. Brenda had been preparing for it all week, cooking enough food to feed half the county. There would be dozens of trucks parked in the front pasture. The house would be packed with people moving from the kitchen to the living room. The noise would be constant and loud. It was the perfect cover. With so many guests paying their respects, neither Brenda nor Wyatt would be able to monitor the front door, let alone the back corridors of the house. If I slipped in through the mudroom, while everyone was distracted by the food and the condolences, I could reach the office, plug in the drive, authenticate the network, and download whatever my grandfather had hidden. I drove back to my apartment as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, dark shadows across the plains. The reality of what I was about to do settled heavy in my stomach. This was not a simple coding error I could fix from the safety of my desk. This was trespassing. This was digital espionage against my own blood. I walked into my kitchen and opened the cabinet above the fridge. I pulled out a bottle of cheap bourbon I kept for emergencies. I poured a glass, not bothering with ice. I took a hard swallow. The liquid burned down my throat, but it did nothing to stop my hands from shaking. I set the glass down and stared at the metal USB drive sitting next to my laptop. Resentment flared hot and sharp in my chest. I hated my grandfather in that moment. I hated Dale for playing games. If he knew Wyatt was stealing, if he knew the ranch was in danger of foreclosure, he should have handled it while he was still breathing. He was the patriarch. He had the legal power to stop this. Instead, he left a cryptic puzzle for the granddaughter he allowed the family to mock and discard. He forced me into a dangerous corner, demanding I prove my worth from beyond the grave. The dread of facing Aunt Brenda and Wyatt made me physically nauseous. My stomach churned. I pictured Brenda's harsh glare and her cutting words. I pictured Wyatt's desperate, unpredictable panic. I was about to walk straight into a house full of people who firmly believed I was a failure, and I had to do it with a steady hand. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I closed my eyes, trying to force my breathing to slow down. I had to focus on the code. I had to treat my own family like a security firewall I needed to bypass. When you know you are walking straight into a hostile environment, what is your strategy to keep from falling apart? The parking lot of this Carter ranch was packed tight. Trucks of every make and model lined the dirt driveway, their engines ticking as they cooled in the biting winter air. It was Friday evening. The Chuckwagon Memorial was in full swing. Smoke from the massive outdoor smokers drifted low over the frozen ground, carrying the thick, heavy scent of roasting meat and burning mesquite wood. I zipped my thin jacket tighter around my neck. The wind was relentless, carrying a sharp chill that promised a hard freeze before midnight. I walked up the porch steps, my boots crunching on the packed snow. This was an authentic Wyoming gathering. No catered waiters or hushed string quartets. The large kitchen and adjoining living room were filled with local ranchers wearing worn Carhartt jackets, mechanics from town, and neighbors who had known Dale since he first took over the cattle operation decades ago. The food was spread out across long folding tables, massive pots of spicy elk chili platters of thick cornbread and jars of dark, sweet chokecherry jam. People offered gruff, practical condolences. They clapped Wyatt on the back, telling him his grandfather was a tough old bastard, but a fair one. I slipped through this front door, hoping to blend into the crowd. I wanted to stay invisible, keep my head down, and make my way to the back hallway without drawing attention. I made it exactly 10 feet into the living room before I was intercepted. Aunt Brenda blocked my path. She held a stack of empty paper plates against her chest like a shield. She wore a black wool sweater, her graying hair pulled back into a severe tight knot. Her face was tight lines of exhaustion and grief etched deep around her mouth. She stared at me, her eyes hardening. "I thought you made your dramatic exit in Cheyenne," she said. Her voice carried over the low hum of conversation nearby. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to hold her gaze. "I came to pay my respects. He was my grandfather, too." Brenda let out a short, humorless scoff. "He was a paycheck to you, just like he was to your father. You left this place behind the minute you figured out you could type on a keyboard instead of working the dirt. You would not know how to handle a shovel if your life depended on it." The words stung, hitting a tender, exposed nerve. She knew exactly how to make me feel small. I did not argue with her. I did not try to defend my career or my choices. I kept my face blank, offered a tight, forced nod, and stepped around her, merging back into the flow of guests, moving toward the food tables. I waited 20 agonizing minutes near the kitchen. I watched the crowd tracking the movements of the key players. Brenda was busy organizing the dessert table, cornered by two elderly neighbors discussing weather patterns. Wyatt was standing near the fireplace, holding a plate of food he was not eating, engaged in a tense, hushed conversation with a man I recognized as the loan officer from the local community bank. This was my window. The hallway leading to Dale's back office was empty. The door was closed. I walked quickly down the hall, my heart beginning a heavy, frantic beat against my sternum. I turned the brass knob. It clicked open. The room was dark, smelling faintly of old leather and pipe tobacco. I closed the door behind me and locked it. The only light came from the blue glow of the router sitting on the heavy oak desk. I set my laptop on the desk and pulled the metal USB drive from my pocket. My hands were shaking. I plugged the drive into the port. The familiar black terminal window popped up on my screen, waiting for the local network handshake. I opened my Wi-Fi settings and selected the ranch's internal network. A prompt appeared. Enter administrator password. This was the realistic obstacle I had anticipated. There was no magic hacking software that could brute force a modern router password in seconds. I had to know the code, or I had to guess it based on human behavior. People are predictable. They use dates, names, significant events. I tried Dale's birthday. The screen flashed red. Access denied. I tried the year the ranch was founded, a date proudly painted on the sign above the main gate. The screen flashed red again. Access denied. Panic flared in my chest, hot and sharp. I had 3 attempts left before the system would likely lock me out for 24 hours, alerting the network administrator to the failed login attempt. I stared at the prompt, trying to think like the person who set up this network. It was not Dale. Dale hated technology. Brenda managed the books. Brenda set up the Wi-Fi. Brenda managed the router. What did Brenda hold on to tighter than anything else? What was the defining moment of her bitterness? It was not a happy memory. It was a wound. I typed in the sequence of numbers. October 14, 1998. The exact date my father packed his bags, walked out of this house, and left Brenda to handle the harsh winters and the aging patriarch alone. It was the date she cemented her resentment. I hit enter. The screen froze for one agonizing second. Then the prompt disappeared. The terminal window flashed green. Authentication successful. Decrypting files. A progress bar appeared on the screen. 10%. 20%. I watched the bar creep forward, my breath catching in my throat. I could hear the muffled sounds of the memorial gathering through the heavy wooden door. Laughter, clinking silverware, the low hum of voices. The contrast between the mundane dinner party outside and the digital theft happening inside the office made my skin crawl. 40%. 50%. The files transferring to my local drive were massive. Spreadsheets, PDF, documents, encrypted financial logs spanning back 5 years. This was the proof. This was whatever Dale had hidden to expose the broker Wyatt was using. 70%. 80%. The bar inched forward. The hard drive whirred softly. Then the brass doorknob rattled. Someone tried to open the locked door. My blood turned to ice water. I froze my hand, hovering over the keyboard. Emily Wyatt's voice carried through the thick wood, muffled but urgent. The doorknob rattled again, harder this time. "Open the door. I know you are in there." The progress bar hit 95%. I could not yank the USB drive out now. If I severed the connection before the decryption finished, the files would corrupt, rendering the evidence useless. I needed 5 more seconds. "I am coming." I called out, my voice betraying my panic, cracking audibly. "I am just looking for something." I grabbed the laptop lid, ready to slam it shut. The progress bar hit 100%. Transfer complete. I ripped the USB drive from the port and shoved it deep into my jacket pocket. I slammed the laptop shut and shoved it recklessly into my messenger bag, knocking a heavy ceramic cup full of pens off the edge of the desk. It hit the hardwood floor with a loud, distinct clatter, scattering ink pens everywhere. I scrambled to unlock the door, throwing it open, just as Wyatt raised his fist to knock again. Wyatt stood in the hallway. He did not look like a menacing antagonist preparing for a confrontation. He looked physically ill. His skin was pale, carrying a sickly grayish hue under the dim hallway lighting. He was not holding a weapon or clenching his fists. He was holding a plastic bottle of cheap antacids, his fingers gripping it so tightly the plastic crinkled. Dark circles bagged heavily under his eyes. The swagger from the law office was entirely gone. "What are you doing in his office?" Wyatt demanded, his voice strained, lacking its usual aggressive punch. He stepped forward, trying to look past me into the dark room. I stammers badly, my tongue feeling thick and useless. I was just looking for a photograph, the one of Grandpa and me fishing. From when I was a kid, I wanted a copy. It was a pathetic, flimsy excuse, and I knew it the moment the words tumbled out of my mouth. My heart was hammering so hard I was certain he could hear it. I was sweating, my face flushed with adrenaline and fear. Wyatt stared at me, his eyes narrowing. He looked at my messenger bag, then back to my face. He looked too exhausted to argue, too drained by his own hidden debts to push an interrogation. "Get out of here, Emily," he muttered, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Just get your coat and leave. You do not belong here anymore." I did not wait for him to change his mind. I clutched my bag to my chest and bolted down the hallway. My knees felt weak, threatening to buckle with every step. I pushed through the crowded living room, ignoring the stares of the neighbors, ignoring Brenda calling my name from the kitchen. I burst through the front door, the freezing winter air hitting my face like a physical blow. I ran to my car, my breath tearing ragged through my throat. I threw my bag onto the passenger seat, cranked the engine, and sped down the dirt driveway, the tires spinning on the packed snow. I had barely escaped, but the encrypted financial logs were secure on my local drive. I had the evidence. Now I just had to figure out what Wyatt was actually doing. I locked my apartment door and did not leave for 2 days. The Wyoming winter howled outside my thin windows, throwing sharp gusts of snow against the glass, but I barely noticed. My small living room became a war room. Empty coffee cups piled up on the counter. The radiator hissed a steady, irritating rhythm. I sat huddled under a wool blanket on my sofa, my laptop burning hot against my knees. The decryption of the USB drive gave me raw data. Thousands of rows of financial transactions, metadata, and encrypted communication logs. It was a digital labyrinth. I wrote Python scripts to filter the noise, looking for the obvious patterns. I wanted to find receipts for Wyatt's vanity. I expected to see charges for custom ski gear, first-class flights, expensive dinners in Jackson Hole, and luxury vehicles. That was the narrative I had built in my head. The arrogant, entitled cousin draining the family legacy to fund a hollow rich lifestyle while mocking me for working a real job. But my scripts kept returning empty results. The money was not going to luxury brands or high-end resorts. The deeper I dug into the ledgers, the more that arrogant picture fractured. The funds were indeed flowing out of the estate operational accounts, but they were pouring into a series of obscure shell companies. I spent 12 exhausting hours tracing the registration records of those entities. When the final query finished compiling on my screen, I sat back in my chair, stunned. The shell companies were holding entities for real estate. Specifically, they held the deeds to the arid, undeveloped parcels of land bordering the Carter Ranch to the west, the exact location where I had seen those pristine white surveying trucks parked just days ago. Wyatt was not stealing to fund a lavish lifestyle. He was buying dirt. I cross-referenced the public county records online. A major commercial developer out of Denver had filed preliminary zoning permits to buy up the valley. They were planning to build a sprawling industrial complex right on our property line. The project would have cut off our primary water access, polluted the grazing land, and choked the cattle operation our family had run for generations. Wyatt had discovered the corporate plan and tried to stop it. He tried to buy the border parcels to create a buffer zone and protect the ranch. It was a desperate, frantic act of loyalty. He wanted to be the savior of the Carter legacy, but he did not have the liquid capital to fight a corporate developer. To get the money, he took out high-interest, short-term loans from a shadow lending firm in Colorado. Predatory lenders, the kind of firms that do not care about family heritage or Wyoming history, only their collateral. He got in way over his head. The interest compounded. The loan shark started circling, demanding repayment he could not provide. I stared at the glowing monitor, feeling a strange, unsettling twist in my gut. My enemy had a noble motive, but his methods were catastrophic. He was trying to save the house by setting the foundation on fire. To keep the creditors at bay, Wyatt needed leverage he did not legally possess. That was where the encrypted logs got dark. The data showed repeated unauthorized digital pings to the Federal Energy Registry. Grandpa Dale held lucrative mineral rights on federal land across the Laramie Plains, generating energy royalties every quarter. Those leases were highly regulated by the government. Wyatt had hired a third-party broker, a shady digital facilitator who used spoofed IP addresses to bypass the security protocols of the Federal Registry. Wyatt was illegally leveraging Dale's federal energy leases as collateral to pay off his personal loan sharks. He was quietly mortgaging the core engine of the Carter estate to save the surface dirt. I rubbed my tired eyes. The legal reality of what I was looking at settled over me like a lead weight. I could not just print these spreadsheets, drive down to the local sheriff, and demand Wyatt be arrested. The local deputies handled bar fights, trespassing, and highway accidents. They had zero jurisdiction over federal mineral rights, interstate wire fraud, and cyber spoofing. If I handed this stack of papers to the local police, they would stare at the code file, a slow-moving report, and toss it in a drawer while the estate bled dry. I needed to present a flawless, undeniable forensic software trail to a federal judge. I had to prove the digital signature on those spoofed IP addresses belonged to Wyatt, tying him directly to the wire fraud. My phone buzzed on the desk, shattering the quiet focus of my apartment. It was Thomas. I answered on speakerphone, my fingers still flying across the keyboard as I sorted the metadata. I told him I had the proof. I told him Wyatt was not stealing for himself, but leveraging the federal leases to pay off predatory loans connected to the adjacent land. Thomas did not sound relieved. His voice was heavy, drained of its usual sharp legal edge. He told me it did not matter what I had found if we ran out of time. He delivered the crushing blow. The local probate judge had moved faster than anyone anticipated. The Wyoming bank holding the estate funds had formally approved Wyatt's emergency motion for operational capital. I stopped typing. The silence in my apartment suddenly felt very loud. I asked Thomas what that meant. He said the $2 million in liquid cash would be released directly into an account Wyatt controlled. The transfer was scheduled to drop in exactly 4 days. Once that cash hit Wyatt's account, he would immediately wire it to the loan sharks to cover his margin calls. That money would cross state lines, vanish into a labyrinth of unregulated debt collectors, and we would never see a single cent of it again. The ranch would have zero operating budget. They would default by spring. I urged Thomas to file an injunction. I told him to call the bank and tell them to stop the transfer. Thomas let out a harsh sigh. He explained that a local bank will not halt a court-ordered probate transfer based on a phone call from a disgruntled granddaughter claiming cyber fraud. The only thing that could stop that wire transfer was a federal freeze order. And to get a federal freeze order, we needed to file a comprehensive motion with a district judge backed by physical witness testimony or undeniable forensic proof. 4 days. Thomas hung up, leaving me listening to the dead air. The pressure clamped down on my chest, tight and unforgiving. I looked at the lines of code on my monitor. 4 days to untangle a web of spoofed IP addresses, build a federal cyber case, and secure a judge's signature. It was an impossible timeline. I had barely slept in 2 days. I was running on stale coffee and adrenaline, and it was suddenly not enough. The weight of the entire Carter legacy rested on my shoulders, the shoulders of the girl they had thrown away and mocked. I stood up from my desk. My legs felt shaky. I walked into the small kitchen and picked up a heavy ceramic coffee mug from the counter. I gripped it tight, my knuckles turning white. The sheer injustice of it all boiled over. Dale left me this cryptic mess. Wyatt created the disaster. Brenda enabled it. And I was the one suffocating under the deadline expected to fix a family that did not even want me. I threw the mug into the stainless steel sink. It shattered with a sharp, piercing crack. Shards of ceramic scattered across the metal drain. I gripped the edge of the counter, my head bowed, and I cried. It was not a quiet, dignified cry. It was messy, ugly, gasping sobs born of pure frustration and exhaustion. I hated them for putting me in this position. I hated that I cared enough to try and fix it. I stayed there for a long time, staring at the broken pieces in the sink, letting the panic run its course, until there was nothing left but a cold, hard resolve. Discovering your enemy had a noble motive, but used terrible methods. Does that change how you judge them? I stared at the broken ceramic in the sink until the tears stopped. Thomas was right. Computer code alone was not enough for a fast-tracked federal injunction. A judge would look at my spreadsheets and see easily manipulated numbers. I needed corroboration. I needed a physical witness who could testify to Wyatt's desperation and financial erraticism under oath. The only person who lived in that house, saw the mail, and watched Wyatt panic every single day was Aunt Brenda. I had to go back to the ranch. The drive out to the property was brutal. The Chinook winds had picked up, sweeping across the open plains with a punishing force that threatened to push my Subaru off the asphalt. The Wyoming winter does not care about family drama. It is a harsh, isolating force that tears things apart if they are not anchored deep in the dirt. I pulled up to the main gate. The house looked empty. Wyatt's truck was gone. I parked and walked toward the western pasture, pulling my collar high against the biting chill. I found her half a mile down the property line. Brenda was out there alone, bundled in a faded canvas coat, wrestling with a snapped spool of barbed wire. The wooden fence posts groaned under the wind. She was trying to splice the wire back together with a pair of rusted pliers, but her bare hands were shaking from the cold. Her breath plumed in jagged bursts. She was 60 years old, doing the manual labor of a ranch hand, half her age, too stubborn to ask for help. I did not announce myself. I walked up to the fence line, reached out, and grabbed the loose end of the barbed wire. The metal bit into my thick leather gloves. Brenda jumped, startled, her head snapping up. Her face was red from the wind, her lips chapped. She opened her mouth to shout at me, to demand what I was doing back on her dirt. I ignored her. I told her to pull the tension tight while I wrapped the splice. She hesitated, her eyes narrowing, but the wire was heavy and she was losing her grip. She leaned back, pulling the line taut. I clamped the pliers down and twisted the sharp metal. Our hands were numb, clumsy, working in forced tandem against the freezing wind. The moment the wire was secure, the fragile truce shattered. Brenda dropped her end of the line and shoved her hands deep into her coat pockets. She demanded to know why I was harassing them. She said I was just like my father, showing up when it was convenient, pretending to care about the work when I had no dirt under my fingernails. She yelled that my dad was a coward who ran to the city the minute the winters got too hard, leaving her to care for an aging patriarch and a struggling herd. The cold burned my lungs as I yelled back. I did not deliver a polished, clever response. My voice was raw, breaking over the howling wind. I told her my father left because Dale was a tyrant who never respected him, and Brenda stayed because she was addicted to being the victim. I screamed that her martyrdom was a self-inflicted prison. She chose to suffer, and she used that suffering as a weapon to make everyone else feel inadequate. Tears streamed down my face, freezing instantly against my cheeks. Brenda took a step toward me, her eyes furious. She pointed a thick, calloused finger at my chest. She told me I knew nothing about survival. She said Wyatt was the only one trying to keep the developers from paving over our history. She yelled that I had no idea the pressure her son was under, the people he had to deal with, the brokers he had to hire just to keep the bank from foreclosing on the pastures. The wind seemed to stop for a fraction of a second. The word hung in the freezing air between us. Brokers. I stared at her. My chest tightened. I asked her what broker she was talking about. Brenda's face drained of color. She realized her mistake. She tried to backtrack, stammering that Wyatt had financial advisors, that he was handling the business end of things. She was not a mastermind either. She was a desperate mother who had turned a blind eye to the suspicious phone calls and the shady digital transfers. She knew Wyatt was crossing lines to keep the ranch afloat, and she chose not to ask questions. I unzipped my coat and pulled a folded stack of printed spreadsheets from my inside pocket. I thrust the papers into her trembling hands. I told her to look at them. I told her Wyatt was not just hiring advisors. He was committing federal wire fraud. He was spoofing IP addresses to mortgage the energy leases. Brenda stared at the numbers, the wind whipping the corners of the pages. She shook her head, insisting Wyatt would fix it once the $2 million cleared probate. She said he promised her the debt was manageable. I took a step closer, my boots crunching in the snow. I pointed to the third page in her hand. I told her to read the collateral listings on the predatory loan. I did not soften the blow. I told her Wyatt did not just leverage the energy leases. The loan sharks required physical property backing. He forged her signature and put her personal house up as collateral. The papers slipped from Brenda's grip, scattering across the frozen dirt. Her knees buckled. She collapsed backward, hitting the wooden fence post she had just repaired. She slid down to the snow-covered ground, her arms wrapping around her stomach, like she had been physically struck. The wind howled around her, carrying the sound of her jagged, broken sobs. All her stubborn pride, all her decades of hard labor, wiped out by the son she had protected at all costs. She was going to lose the roof over her head. I dropped to my knees in the snow beside her. I begged her to come to Thomas with me. I told her we had 4 days before the bank released the estate funds into Wyatt's control. If she testified to the judge about the forged collateral and the brokers, we could freeze the accounts. We could save her house. We could stop the developers. Brenda looked up at me. Her face was wrecked, her eyes hollow. She asked what would happen to Wyatt if she told a federal judge he committed wire fraud and forgery. I could not lie to her. I told her he would face indictment. He would go to federal prison. Brenda wiped her nose with the back of her canvas sleeve. She looked at the scattered papers blowing across the pasture, then looked at me. She shook her head slowly. She said she would not be the one to lock her only child in a cage. She told me to leave. She refused to testify. I stood up, the cold seeping into my bones, realizing the bitter truth. Brenda was choosing to drown with her son rather than save the legacy. I walked back to my car alone, the freezing wind pushing against my back. I had the code, but I had no witness. The 4-day clock was ticking down, and I was entirely on my own to fight a legal war I did not know how to win. I drove back to Cheyenne the next morning with the scattered spreadsheets stuffed into my passenger seat. The sky remained a flat, unbroken gray, the color of wet concrete. Brenda's refusal to testify echoed in my head a stubborn loop of misplaced loyalty that left me cornered. Without her sworn statement confirming the forged collateral, my digital logs were just raw data. Any competent defense attorney would argue the logs had been manipulated, especially since I was the one who extracted them. The local probate court would never halt a $2 million transfer based on uncorroborated code. I found Thomas in his office sorting through stacks of manila folders. The heavy oak paneling of the room felt suffocating. I dropped my laptop bag on his desk and told him Brenda was out. She chose her son over the ranch. Thomas stopped sorting. He took off his wire-rimmed glasses and pinched the bridge of his nose, the gesture of a man who had navigated family disasters for 30 years. He leaned back in his leather chair and explained the harsh legal reality of our situation. Wyoming probate law moves on a rigid track. The local bank handling Dale's estate was legally obligated to execute the emergency transfer by close of business on Friday. Thomas said we could not stop the local bank from fulfilling a county judge's order. We had no local jurisdiction to block it. However, there was a federal loophole. Thomas pulled a thick binder from his shelf. He explained that because Dale's energy leases involved federal mineral rights on government land, those specific assets fell under federal oversight. If we could prove wire fraud was occurring across state lines to collateralize federal assets, we could bypass the local probate court entirely. Thomas said we needed to file a federal lease pendens, a notice of pending action. It is a severe legal maneuver that instantly clouds the title of an asset. If a federal judge signed it, it would trigger an automatic immediate freeze on every bank account linked to those energy leases. Wyatt would not be able to touch a dime. But there was a catch. Wyatt had used a third-party broker to execute the fraudulent transfers. The broker spoofed the IP addresses, bouncing the digital signatures through servers in Eastern Europe and South America to mask the origin. Thomas tapped my laptop screen. He said the federal court would not accept anonymous spoofed metadata as probable cause for an emergency injunction. I had to prove that Wyatt Carter, sitting in Wyoming, was the individual who authorized those specific transfers. I had to bridge the gap between the shadow broker and my cousin's laptop. I stared at the screen. I am a software developer. I build logistics architecture for shipping routes. I do not hunt cyber criminals for the government. The task required a level of forensic tracing I had only read about in security forums. Thomas checked his watch. It was 4 p.m. on Thursday. The bank transfer was scheduled for 5 o'clock on Friday. We had exactly 25 hours. I drove back to Laramie at 80 miles an hour. I locked the door to my apartment, closed the blinds, and set up a workstation on my small kitchen table. I brewed an entire pot of strong, bitter coffee. The ticking clock was no longer a metaphor. It was a physical weight pressing down on my lungs. I spent the next 12 hours staring at the raw code. The broker had hidden the authorization pings well. The digital trail vanished into a maze of proxy servers. My eyes burned. My back ached from hunching over the keyboard. By 3 a.m, my apartment felt like a pressure cooker. Empty coffee mugs littered the table. My hair was a tangled mess. I was running on pure jagged adrenaline and the stubborn refusal to let Wyatt destroy what my grandfather had built. I wrote a custom Python script designed to scrape the metadata of the transaction timestamps. I was not looking for the IP address. I was looking for the behavioral pattern. Wyatt was not a tech genius. He was a stressed-out, panicked outfitter drowning in debt. He had a habit of checking his financial portals obsessively. I mapped the exact milliseconds the fraudulent federal transfers were initiated and cross-referenced them with the local network logs from the ranch router I had copied during the memorial dinner. At 4:30 a.m, the script finished compiling, a single clear line of data highlighted in green on my monitor. The authorization ping for the largest shadow transfer occurred at exactly the same millisecond that a device registered as Wyatt's personal smartphone disconnected from the ranch's internal Wi-Fi network and switched to a cellular data tower. He had authorized the broker's transaction from his driveway, likely while pacing and yelling at his creditors, just before the phone hopped networks. The digital fingerprint matched his device's unique MAC address. I had tied the federal wire fraud directly to his phone in his hand. I hit print. The laser printer whirred, spitting out 30 pages of irrefutable time-stamped forensic evidence. I called Thomas at 5 a.m. He answered, sounding groggy but alert. I told him I had the bridge. I had linked Wyatt to the broker. Thomas told me to upload the files to his secure server immediately. He said he would draft the lis pendens and submit the emergency injunction through the federal court's e-filing system as soon as the clerk's office opened at 8. We had plenty of time before the Friday afternoon bank deadline. I uploaded the encrypted files, hit send, and collapsed onto my sofa. I did not sleep. My heart was beating too fast. I watched the sun slowly rise over the Laramie plains, casting a pale, cold light through my blinds. The hardest part was over. The code was solid. The law was on our side. At 8:15, my phone rang. It was Thomas. I answered, expecting confirmation that the judge had received the files. Instead, Thomas sounded frantic. He told me the federal e-filing system was down. I sat up, the exhaustion vanishing instantly. I asked him what he meant. I asked if his internet was out. Thomas said it was not his network. It was a regional server outage affecting the entire federal district court system in Cheyenne. No digital documents could be submitted, processed, or viewed by a judge. The IT department estimated the system would be down for maintenance until Monday morning. Monday was too late. The bank transfer would clear in 8 hours. Wyatt would wire the $2 million to the loan sharks, and the money would be gone forever. Thomas told me there was only one workaround. We had to file the lis pendens in person. We had to physically hand the printed forensic logs and the legal injunction to the federal clerk at the courthouse. The federal courthouse was in Casper, a 3-hour drive north across the open, unforgiving plains. I grabbed my keys, shoved the printed stack of evidence into my bag, and ran out the door. Have you ever fought against a bureaucratic system that felt perfectly designed to make you fail? I picked up Thomas outside his Cheyenne office at 9 a.m. He wore a heavy wool overcoat, clutching a thick leather briefcase tight against his chest. He threw his bag onto the floorboard and climbed into the passenger seat without a word. The sky above us had darkened to a deep, bruised purple. The temperature was dropping fast, the air feeling heavy and dense. We hit Interstate 25, heading north toward Casper. The first hour of the drive was tense but manageable. We rode in silence, the radio off my mind, racing through the logic of my code, praying the federal judge would understand the metadata. Then, just past Chugwater, the Wyoming winter decided to show us exactly how insignificant we were. The squall hit without warning. It was not a gentle snowfall. It was a brutal, blinding wall of whiteout conditions. The wind howled across the plains, hammering the side of my Subaru with enough force to shove the car toward the shoulder. The temperature plummeted, turning the moisture on the asphalt into a solid, frictionless sheet of black ice. Visibility dropped to less than 50 feet. My knuckles turned white as I gripped the steering wheel. I leaned forward, my chest practically touching the column, straining to see the faint yellow lines of the highway. The heater was blasting on full, but the cold seeped through the glass, settling into my bones. Thomas sat rigid, his hand gripping the passenger side handle. He did not suggest we turn back, but the fear in his posture was obvious. We crept along at 30 miles an hour. Passing the overturned, jackknifed remains of a massive semi-truck in the ditch sent a sharp spike of terror straight through my chest. The physical obstacle was terrifying. One wrong movement, one patch of ice hit too fast, and we would roll into the frozen basin. If we crashed, the paperwork stayed in the car, the bank deadline would pass, and the estate would be drained. While I was fighting for traction on a deadly highway, gripping the wheel until my hands cramped, Wyatt was entirely comfortable. He was sitting in a warm, high-end coffee shop in Jackson Hole. He wore a cashmere sweater, sipping a dark roast espresso. The ambient noise of the cafe, the soft jazz, and the hiss of the espresso machine provided a comfortable backdrop. He had a Bluetooth earpiece and projecting an air of total unbothered control. He was talking to the collection agent from the Colorado lending firm. Wyatt leaned back in his leather chair, a smug smile playing on his lips. He told the agent to calm down. He promised the funds were secured. He spoke with the arrogance of a man who believed he had outsmarted everyone. He assured the voice on the other end of the line that the $2 million bank transfer was guaranteed by 5 o'clock that afternoon. He boasted about the efficiency of his brokers. He promised the wire would clear their accounts before the weekend, saving the collateral and paying off the margin call in full. He believed his shadow maneuvers were flawless, that his tracks were perfectly covered, and that the annoying software developer cousin he had mocked his entire life was safely out of the picture. He had no idea I was currently risking my life on black ice to ensure that money never reached his hands. The drive that should have taken 3 hours stretched into an agonizing 6. Every mile fought for every slick curve, navigated with suffocating anxiety. I cursed my grandfather under my breath for forcing this burden onto me. I cursed the archaic federal filing system, but I kept my foot steady on the pedal. We pulled into the parking lot of the Casper Federal Courthouse at 4:15 in the afternoon. The digital clock on my dashboard glared at me in bright red numbers. We had exactly 45 minutes before the bank executed the transfer. I threw the car into park. Thomas and I grabbed our bags and sprinted through the slush toward the heavy glass doors of the courthouse. The heat inside the building hit us like a physical blow. We rushed the security checkpoint. The metal detectors felt agonizingly slow. I had to take off my boots, my belt pulling my laptop out of the bag with shaking hands, while the security guards moved with casual, bureaucratic indifference. At 4:25, we hit the clerk's office on the 3rd floor. The clerk behind the counter was an older woman who looked annoyed by our frantic energy. Thomas slammed the printed forensic logs and the drafted injunction onto the counter. He demanded an emergency review by the duty judge, citing imminent massive financial fraud across federal lines. The clerk blinked, slowly adjusted her glasses, and began carefully, deliberately stamping each individual page of the 30-page document. The loud thud of her ink stamp echoed in the quiet room, sounding like a countdown clock in my head. I paced the small waiting area, my heart hammering against my ribs, watching the wall clock tick closer to 4:35. The clerk finally took the stack of papers and disappeared down a long hallway toward the judge's chambers. Thomas and I stood in silence. The adrenaline that had fueled me through the blizzard was starting to burn off, leaving a sickening hollow feeling in my stomach. The silence of the courthouse was suffocating. If the judge did not understand the Python script, if he questioned the IP spoofing methodology, he would deny the injunction. 4:45. The heavy wooden doors to the chambers remained shut. 4:50. Thomas checked his phone. The bank in Cheyenne closed at 5. The automated wire transfer system would trigger the release at exactly that moment. At 4:52, the clerk emerged from the hallway. She walked back to the counter, her expression unchanged. She slid a single piece of paper across the desk toward Thomas. The bottom of the page bore a fresh dark blue signature. The federal judge had reviewed the metadata and found probable cause. The injunction was granted. Thomas did not waste a second. He pulled out his phone, snapped a high-resolution scan of the signed order, and immediately emailed the PDF directly to the legal compliance department of the Wyoming bank, copying the branch manager. He followed it up with a direct phone call barking instructions into the receiver, confirming receipt of the federal freeze order. He hung up the phone and looked at me. He nodded once. The freeze was active. I did not cheer. I did not pump my fist in victory. The crushing weight of the past 48 hours, the sleepless coding, the terrifying drive, the sheer emotional toll of fighting my own family crashed down on me all at once. My knees buckled. I stumbled away from the counter, pressing my back against the cool marble wall of the courthouse hallway. I slid down until I hit the floor. The adrenaline left my system in a violent rush, leaving me nauseous and shaking. I leaned over a small trash can near the water fountain and dry heaved my body, rejecting the stress. The $2 million was locked. Wyatt's financial lifeline was dead. The Colorado loan sharks would not get their money. The shell companies would default. The estate was safe from the corporate developers. 10 minutes later, as I sat on the cold floor trying to catch my breath, my phone began to vibrate violently in my coat pocket. I pulled it out. The caller ID flashed Wyatt's name. The bank had just notified him. He knew the money was blocked. He knew his arrogant promises to the creditors were worthless. He knew I had beaten him. I answered the call. Wyatt did not yell. He did not threaten me with lawyers. His voice sounded thin, frantic, like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and realized there was no safety net below. He was completely unhinged. He demanded I meet him at the local Laramie rodeo grounds immediately. He said if I did not show up, if I did not lift the injunction, he was driving straight to the ranch. He threatened to take a sledgehammer to the server room. He swore he would physically destroy the hardware holding the original trust documents and deeds, burning the entire legacy to the ground so no one could have it. The drive back down from Casper felt entirely different. The blizzard had broken, leaving the highway clear but treacherous, mirroring the situation I was driving into. I dropped Thomas off at his office in Cheyenne. He warned me not to meet Wyatt alone. He said desperate people do dangerous things when cornered. I told him I had to go. Wyatt was not a stranger in an alley. He was blood, and he was threatening the core foundation of our grandfather's estate. If he destroyed those physical servers before Thomas could secure court custody of the hardware, the legal mess would take years to untangle. I could not let that happen. I pulled into the Laramie rodeo grounds just past 9 at night. The place was a ghost town during the winter months. The massive wooden bleachers loomed empty in the darkness. The dirt arena, usually churned up by bucking broncos and roping horses during the summer festivals, was frozen solid. The only illumination came from a few harsh, buzzing halogen security lights mounted high on the wooden poles, casting long, bleak shadows across the dirt. Wyatt's truck was parked near the center of the arena, the engine idling, exhaust plumes rising thick in the freezing air. I parked my Subaru a safe distance away, keeping the headlights on. I stepped out into the biting cold. My boots crunched on the frozen dirt. My ribs ached from tension, and my hands were shaking inside my coat pockets. Wyatt was pacing in the illuminated circle of his headlights. He did not look like the confident, smirking cousin who had mocked me at the will reading. He did not look like the arrogant outfitter who catered to Jackson Hole billionaires. He looked completely shattered. He wore a thin jacket shivering violently, his arms crossed tight over his chest. His hair was disheveled, and his face was drawn pale under the harsh halogen glow. When he saw me walking toward him, he stopped pacing. He did not yell. He did not charge at me. He just stood there looking small and defeated. I stopped 10 feet away. The silence of the empty arena was heavy, broken only by the low rumble of our idling engines. "What did you do?" "Emily." Wyatt's voice was a cracked, hollow rasp. He did not sound angry. He sounded devastated. "You froze the accounts. The bank locked everything. I kept my distance. I told him I knew about the broker. I told him I traced the spoofed IP addresses back to his phone. I knew he was leveraging the federal energy leases to pay off the shadow lenders in Colorado. I said I had given the forensic logs to a federal judge to stop the transfer." Wyatt let out a sharp, choked sound. His knees buckled slightly, and he leaned hard against the grill of his truck to keep from falling. He covered his face with his hands, his shoulders heaving. He broke down sobbing openly in the freezing dirt. It was a pathetic, raw display of vulnerability. "I did not want to do this," he cried, pulling his hands away from his face. His eyes were red wide with pure terror. "I was trying to save the land. The developers were going to pave over the western basin. They were going to choke the water supply. Grandpa was dying, and he refused to see what was happening. He refused to fight them. I had to buy those border parcels to create a buffer. I had to protect the legacy. I stared at him, feeling a sudden confusing surge of pity mix with my exhaustion. He was not a villain trying to steal the money for a ski chalet. He was a desperate heir trying to force a rescue operation without the capital to back it up. But you used predatory lenders. Wyatt? I stammered, my voice thick. I did not sound triumphant or commanding. I sounded tired, my throat tight with unshed tears. You took money from sharks, and when you could not pay, you tried to steal from the estate. You committed federal wire fraud. Wyatt wiped his nose with the back of his sleeve, leaving a smear of dirt on his cheek. They are going to kill me, Emily. He whispered the words, the reality of his situation stripping away any remaining bravado. He told me the Colorado lenders were not just corporate suits. They were dangerous men. They had threatened him. They had threatened his wife. He said if he did not wire that $2 million by Monday, they were coming for him. He pleaded with me, begging me to call Thomas to lift the injunction just long enough for the wire to clear. He promised he would pay it back. He promised he would find another way to fix the energy leases. My stomach churned. The internal conflict tore at me. I was looking at a terrified boy trapped in a grown man's consequences. I wanted to help him. The instinct to protect family, even the family that had discarded me, flared strong in my chest. But my logical mind, the software developer who dealt in hard facts and rigid structures, knew that releasing those funds would not save him. It would only deepen the fraud, dragging the entire Carter estate down with him. The lenders would take the $2 million and still demand the collateral. The ranch would be gone. I shook my head slowly. The cold air burned my lungs. I cannot lift the freeze, Wyatt. The judge signed the order. It is federal now. It is out of my hands. Wyatt stared at me, the desperation in his eyes curdling into a cornered, frantic panic. You ruined me, he gasped, stepping away from the truck. You took the only way out. I took a breath, forcing myself to hold his gaze. I offered him a harsh, restrictive lifeline. I did not want to see my cousin in a cage, regardless of how he had treated me. I told him I still had the original hard copies of the IP tracing logs. The judge only saw the summary metadata to grant the freeze. I had not turned the full forensic bridge over to the FBI yet. I told Wyatt that if he officially stepped down as the executor of the estate, if he surrendered all claims to the trust and walked away, I would bury the IP evidence. I would not give the federal prosecutors the link they needed to tie the wire fraud directly to his personal devices. He would lose the money, and he would lose the ranch. But I would save him from a 10-year mandatory minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary. I told him he would have to face the creditors on his own, declare bankruptcy and hide, but he would not do it from a prison cell. If you held the evidence to put a family member in prison, would you use it to secure total justice? Or would you offer them a highly restrictive lifeline that leaves them ruined but free? Wyatt's face twisted. The offer of mercy did not calm him. It enraged him. The idea of surrendering the executor title, of admitting total defeat, and walking away with nothing shattered the last remaining pieces of his pride. He was too deep in his own panicked narrative to accept a loss. He lunged toward me, stopping just a few feet away, his fists clenched. He yelled that he would never surrender the estate to me. He said if he was going down, he was making sure there was nothing left for anyone else to take. He spun around, jumped into his truck, and slammed the door. The engine roared as he threw it into gear. He leaned out the window, his face contorted in a mask of pure, frantic desperation. "I am going to the house," he screamed over the engine noise. "The physical deeds, the original trust documents, they are all locked in the server room. If I burn the hardware, there is no proof of the trust. There is no proof of the leases. You get nothing." He slammed his foot on the gas. The heavy tires of his truck spun, kicking up a massive spray of frozen dirt and ice. The truck fishtailed wildly before finding traction, rocketing out of the rodeo arena and speeding off into the darkness, heading straight for the ranch. I threw my car into gear the moment Wyatt's taillights vanished into the dark. I grabbed my phone from the passenger seat, connected it to the Bluetooth dashboard, and dialed 911. The dispatcher answered her voice calm and steady over the static of the connection. I did not waste time explaining federal wire fraud or spoofed IP addresses. I told her there was a domestic disturbance in progress at the Carter Ranch. I said an estranged family member was en route to destroy estate property and was in a highly erratic state. She told me deputies were being dispatched from Laramie. I ended the call and gripped the steering wheel. Wyatt had a head start, and his luxury truck packed a heavy engine. But Wyatt was a creature of comfort. He took the main paved highway, relying on Route 287. He did not realize the black ice on the asphalt would turn his heavy rig into a sliding hazard, forcing him to ride the brakes on every curve. I took the back unpaved county roads. I knew these dirt tracks by heart. When I was a teenager, before I moved away to study software engineering, I used to drive these exact ridges late at night to find a strong enough cell signal to download coding manuals. My Subaru gripped the frozen mud and gravel with sure-footed traction. I killed my headlights on the straightaways using the bright moonlight reflecting off the snow to guide me, pushing the engine as hard as it would go. I beat him to the property line, but just barely. As I pulled up to the main house, I saw Wyatt's truck careen into the driveway, fishtailing wildly before slamming into a wooden hitching post. He did not even bother to turn off the engine. He threw his door open and sprinted toward the back entrance of the house, holding a long iron crowbar he must have grabbed from his truck bed. I scrambled out of my car and ran after him, my boots slipping on the icy porch steps. The front door was left wide open, a freezing draft rushing into the warm house. I heard the unmistakable sound of shattering plastic and tearing metal coming from Dale's back office. I rounded the corner and stood in the doorway. The scene inside was chaos. Wyatt was swinging the heavy iron crowbar into the server racks that housed the ranch's digital backups. Sparks flew as the metal breached the power supply. He struck the main tower again and again, his breath tearing through his throat in ragged gasps. He dropped the crowbar for a second to pull open the heavy steel filing cabinets, ripping handfuls of manila folders and tossing them onto the floor. He was looking for the original deeds, the paper trail that proved the estate's true value and the trust's parameters. He wanted to burn the history to the ground so the federal courts would have nothing to seize. I did not deliver a heroic speech. I did not assume a fighting stance. I just lowered my shoulder and launched my entire body weight at him. It was a clumsy, painful collision. I hit him around the waist just as he turned back toward the servers. The momentum carried us both backward. We crashed onto the hardwood floor, slipping on the scattered paperwork and shattered plastic casing. Wyatt scrambled to his feet, panic fueling his movements. He tried to grab the crowbar again. I grabbed his ankle, twisting hard to pull him down. He kicked his leg free, grabbing me by the shoulders. He shoved me backward with a raw, desperate surge of strength. I flew backward and hit the edge of Dale's solid oak desk. The thick wood caught me squarely in the ribs. A blinding, breathless agony radiated through my chest. I collapsed onto the floor, clutching my side, gasping for air that refused to fill my lungs. The pain was sharp and metallic, pinning me to the ground. Wyatt turned his attention to the heavy floor safe hidden under the Persian rug. The steel door was slightly ajar, a habit Dale always had when he was working late. Wyatt grabbed the heavy handle, trying to yank the door wide open to get to the original paper deeds inside. "Stop it right now!" The voice was shrill and raw. Aunt Brenda stood in the doorway. She wore a thick flannel robe, her gray hair loose around her shoulders. She stared at the ruined office, the smashed servers, and the scattered files. Then she looked at her son, sweating and manic, trying to pry open the family safe, while I lay gasping on the floor. The thick wall of denial Brenda had built around her son shattered into pieces. She saw exactly what he was. He was not the savior of the Carter legacy. He was a frightened, selfish boy, willing to destroy everything she had sacrificed her life to build, just to save his own skin. Brenda did not hesitate. She marched across the room, ignoring the broken glass crunching under her slippers. Wyatt looked up, his eyes wild. "Mom, help me get this open," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "We have to burn the deeds. We have to make it go away." Brenda reached down and slapped his hands away from the steel handle. Her strike was hard, echoing in the small room. She shoved him backward by the shoulders. Wyatt stumbled, too shocked by his mother's intervention to fight back. Brenda reached up to her neck. She was wearing Dale's heavy silver bolo tie, the same one she had gripped so tightly during the will reading. She had worn it every day since he passed a stubborn badge of her loyalty. She pulled the leather cord over her head. She flipped the thick silver ornament over, revealing a faint string of numbers engraved into the tarnished metal on the back. She dropped to her knees beside the floor safe. She slammed the heavy steel door shut. The digital keypad on the front blinked green. Brenda rapidly punched in the 6-digit sequence engraved on the back of the tie, followed by the master override command. A loud mechanical clank echoed from inside the floorboards. The internal deadbolts engaged, sealing the safe permanently. The keypad flashed red, locking out all access until a certified locksmith with a court order could drill it open. The physical deeds, the original trust documents, and the energy lease contracts were secure. Wyatt stared at the red light on the safe. The fight drained out of him all at once. His knees gave out. He collapsed onto the hardwood floor, surrounded by the useless torn folders he had pulled from the cabinets. He pulled his knees to his chest and buried his face in his hands, sobbing openly. His cries were loud and guttural, the sound of a man who knew he had reached the end of the line. Brenda stood over him. She did not reach down to comfort him. She did not stroke his hair. She just stared at the ruined office, her posture stiff, her face pale and exhausted. Flashing red and blue lights illuminated the frosted glass window of the office. The sound of heavy tires crunching on the gravel driveway signaled the arrival of the Albany County Sheriff's deputies. 3 officers pushed through the front door, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. They stepped into the office, shining their flashlights over the smashed servers, the scattered paperwork, and Wyatt crying on the floor. I stayed seated against the oak desk, keeping my arm wrapped tightly around my bruised ribs, wincing with every shallow breath. The lead deputy assessed the room. He did not pull out a pair of handcuffs and arrest Wyatt for complex interstate wire fraud. Local law enforcement did not have the jurisdiction or the evidence to process federal cybercrimes on the spot, but they had clear jurisdiction over the scene in front of them. The deputy asked Brenda who owned the property. Brenda stated the estate was currently in probate, frozen by a federal injunction. The deputy nodded. He pulled Wyatt to his feet. Wyatt offered zero resistance. He let his arms hang limp at his sides as the deputy turned him around and secured his wrists in steel cuffs. The deputy read him his rights, stating he was being detained on charges of felony property destruction, vandalism, and trespassing on a frozen estate. They led him out of the office, his expensive boots dragging across the floorboards. The flashing police lights faded as the cruiser drove away, leaving the house in a heavy, suffocating silence. Brenda picked up the silver bolo tie from the floor, clutching it in her rough hands. She looked at me, her eyes filled with a complicated mix of grief and bitter realization. The physical confrontation was over. The server racks were ruined, but the safe was locked and the federal freeze was holding. However, the messy reality of the legal system was waiting for us in the morning, and the battle over the estate was about to get far more complicated. 3 weeks moved with the slow, agonizing drag of winter shifting into early spring. The adrenaline from the server room fight had long since faded, leaving behind the grinding, bureaucratic reality of the legal system. My bruised ribs turned a deep mottled purple, aching with a dull throb every time I took a deep breath. Wyatt posted bail. He was not allowed back on the property. He moved into a cheap roadside motel on the edge of town, right off Interstate 80, the kind of place with flickering neon signs and semi-trucks idling in the parking lot all night. He was isolated, waiting for the federal prosecutors to build their wire fraud indictment based on the forensic logs I had provided. The fallout in town was swift and unforgiving. Laramie is a small community built on generations of ranching families who know everyone's business. The gossip spread through the feed stores and diners like a brush fire. When I went to the local grocery store to buy coffee and frozen meals, people stared. They did not confront me directly, but I felt the weight of their judgment. In their eyes, I was the city girl who came back just to throw her own cousin in jail and seize the family fortune. They whispered that I was ruthless. They did not know about the shadow brokers or the spoofed IP addresses. They only knew I had broken the cardinal rule of Wyoming culture. I had turned against my own blood. The isolation was heavy, but the legal freeze held firm. The $2 million sat securely in the estate accounts, untouched by the Colorado loan sharks. On a Tuesday morning, Thomas called. He asked me to come to his office in Cheyenne, and he specifically requested that Aunt Brenda attend as well. I arrived 10 minutes early. Brenda was already sitting in the waiting area wearing a faded denim jacket, her posture stiff and unyielding. We did not speak. We had barely exchanged 2 words since the night she locked the floor safe in Dale's office. The silence between us was thick with unresolved grief and mutual exhaustion. Thomas brought us into his heavy oak-paneled office. He sat behind his desk, opening a thick leather-bound portfolio. He did not waste time on pleasantries. He explained that with Wyatt facing federal indictment and the previous will formally contested and frozen by the court, the legal pathway was clear to present the authentic overriding document Dale had filed years ago. Thomas pulled a thick stack of cream-colored paper from the portfolio. He placed it in the center of the desk. This was the Generations Skipping Trust. Thomas said, his voice steady and clinical. Dale established this trust 3 years ago, shortly after he discovered the extent of Wyatt's financial liabilities in Jackson Hole. Dale knew Wyatt was drowning in debt. He knew Wyatt would leverage the estate to save his own outfitting business if given the chance. I leaned forward, my heart beating a faster rhythm against my bruised ribs. I asked what the trust meant for the estate. Thomas adjusted his glasses. He looked directly at me. It means Dale bypassed the immediate generation. He removed Brenda and Wyatt from the financial control line entirely to protect the core assets from creditors. Thomas tapped the cream-colored paper. He stated that I, Emily Carter, was named the sole legal trustee of the federal energy leases and the $2 million in liquid operational capital. I had total unilateral control over the energy royalties and the financial future of the Carter name. I sat back in my chair, stunned. The air in the room felt suddenly thin. I expected to feel a surge of triumph, a rush of vindication after weeks of fighting to prove my worth. Instead, a wave of cold terror washed over me. $2 million, federal energy leases, corporate royalties. I looked at Brenda, expecting an explosion of rage. I expected her to scream that her father had betrayed her, that the city girl had stolen her birthright. Brenda did not yell. She stared at the desk, her face unreadable. She asked Thomas what happened to the physical ranch, the pastures, the barns, the house she had maintained for 40 years. Thomas turned to the next page in the document. This is where Dale compromised, he explained. He severed the financial assets from the physical real estate. The land itself, the cattle operation, and the primary residence are deeded solely to you, Brenda. It was a brilliant, agonizing maneuver by my grandfather. He knew Brenda was fiercely loyal to the dirt. He knew she would never sell the pastures, but he also knew her blind spot for Wyatt made her a massive liability when it came to the corporate finances. He forced a division of power. Brenda controlled the ground, but I controlled the money that kept the ground functional. We were inextricably linked, bound together by a legal document that required us to cooperate if the legacy was going to survive. Thomas closed the portfolio. The probate court has officially validated the trust, he said. The freeze is lifted on your end, Emily. You have full access to the accounts. Brenda stood up slowly. She did not look at me. She gathered her coat, nodded stiffly to Thomas, and walked out of the office. The heavy wooden door clicked shut behind her, leaving me alone with the lawyer and the overwhelming weight of the Carter fortune. I stared at the thick stack of legal paper on the desk. The terror I felt earlier blossomed into full-blown panic. My chest grew tight, my vision blurred. I put my head in my hands, resting my elbows on my knees, and I started to cry. It was not the messy, frustrated crying from my kitchen sink weeks ago. It was a quiet, suffocating weep born from sheer, terrifying responsibility. I told Thomas I could not do this. My voice shook thick with tears. I told him I write code for logistics software. I map delivery routes. I do not know how to manage federal energy leases. I do not know how to negotiate with corporate drilling firms or manage a multi-million-dollar portfolio. I said Dale made a massive mistake. He handed the keys to the kingdom to someone who did not even know how to start the engine. Thomas did not offer empty platitudes. He did not hand me a tissue and tell me everything would be fine. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the desk. He reminded me of what I had accomplished over the past 3 weeks. He pointed out that I had tracked a shadow broker across international proxy servers. I had built a forensic bridge that tied a complex wire fraud scheme directly to a specific mobile device. I had navigated the federal court system during a blizzard and secured an emergency injunction that stopped a corporate heist dead in its tracks. Thomas looked at me, his gaze sharp and unyielding. You mapped the fraud, Emily. You broke down a complex hidden system and found the core truth. Managing an energy portfolio is just another system. It is contracts, royalties, and compliance. It is data. You have the intellect to learn the business. Dale knew that. That is why he gave it to you. I wiped my face with the back of my sleeve. His words settled in my mind, logical and firm, pushing the panic down just enough for me to breathe. I was a software engineer. I built structures. I could build this one. Have you ever fought relentlessly to achieve exactly what you wanted, only to realize the terrifying weight of the responsibility it brings once you actually hold it in your hands? I drove back to Laramie feeling a strange, heavy sense of purpose. The estate was safe. Wyatt's fraudulent transfer was dead. I had the legal authority to protect the energy leases. The storm had finally broken, and I was ready to start learning how to manage the trust. When I unlocked my apartment door and tossed my keys on the counter, I saw a thick manila envelope shoved halfway under my doormat. It was not a letter from the court. It was not a message from Thomas. It was a formal legal notice served by a private courier. I tore open the seal. The header bore the logo of a prominent corporate litigation firm based in Denver, Colorado, the same city where Wyatt's predatory lenders operated. I scanned the dense legal text, my heart sinking with every word. The out-of-state creditors were not backing down. Since the federal injunction blocked their $2 million wire transfer, they were pivoting their strategy. They were formally suing the Carter estate directly. The document claimed that because Wyatt was acting as the de facto executor at the time, he leveraged the federal energy leases. And because he pledged those specific assets as collateral before the Generation Skipping Trust was officially validated by the court, the estate was legally bound to honor the debt. They were demanding $800,000 in immediate restitution, or they would petition a federal judge to seize the energy leases outright. Wyatt's shadow lenders were coming for the trust, and now as the sole legal trustee, the corporate lawsuit was aimed directly at me. I dropped the legal notice on my kitchen counter. The paper felt heavy, carrying the weight of a corporate machine designed to crush anything in its path. The out-of-state creditors were suing the estate for $800,000. Their argument was a brutal, predatory interpretation of the timeline. They claimed that because Wyatt executed the loan agreements using his temporary executor status before Thomas officially unsealed the Generation Skipping Trust in probate court, the collateral pledge was legally binding on the estate itself. If they won, they would seize the energy leases to liquidate the debt, effectively dismantling the financial engine of the Carter legacy before I even had the chance to start the engine. I called my logistics firm the next morning and requested an indefinite leave of absence. My manager, a practical woman who knew I rarely took time off, agreed without asking too many questions. I needed every waking hour to fight this corporate lawsuit. I isolated myself in my cramped Laramie apartment, turning my living room into a bunker of digital contracts, land surveys, and legal filings forwarded by Thomas. The work was exhausting. I spent weeks staring at glowing screens, writing code to parse the metadata of the creditors' loan agreements, hunting for any loophole, any missed signature, any clerical error that could invalidate their claim on the federal leases. My eyes burned constantly. I lived on black coffee and stale toast. My phone buzzed with texts from friends inviting me out for drinks, but I ignored them all. I was completely consumed by the ticking clock of the impending deposition. Late one Tuesday evening, a loud knock rattled my front door. I assumed it was another legal courier. I pulled the door open, ready to sign for another stack of depositions. Aunt Brenda stood in the hallway. She looked uncomfortable, shifting her weight from one boot to the other. She wore her heavy canvas coat, smelling faintly of wood smoke and cold air. In her hands, she held a large stained Tupperware container. She did not offer a warm greeting. She pushed the container toward my chest. She mumbled that it was elk stew left over from the weekend, and she figured I was not eating properly while staring at computer screens all day. It was an awkward, tense olive branch, but it was an olive branch nonetheless. I stepped back and let her inside. She walked into my apartment, her eyes scanning the chaotic mess of printed spreadsheets and land maps covering every surface of my living room. She did not criticize the mess. She set the stew on the small kitchen counter. We stood in the cramped space, the silence between us heavy with the wreckage of the past month. The server room fight, Wyatt's arrest, the revelation of the trust separating the land from the money. It was a massive canyon to bridge. Brenda crossed her arms over her chest. She looked at the floor and admitted, her voice tight, that she had failed as a mother by ignoring Wyatt's panic. She said she let her pride blind her to the danger he was putting the ranch in. It was not a poetic apology. It was a raw, imperfect confession from a woman who had spent her entire life refusing to show weakness. I poured 2 glasses of cheap whiskey and handed her one. I took a sip, the liquid burning a path down my throat. I told her I missed my dad, and I missed the way the ranch used to feel before Dale let his paranoia turn everything into a secret game. We shared a messy moment of grief, acknowledging that Dale's secretive methods had fractured our family just as much as Wyatt's desperation had. We were both victims of a stubborn patriarch who refused to communicate. I walked over to my desk and pulled up the digital profile of the predatory creditor currently suing the estate. I told Brenda I was trying to find a weak point in their corporate structure, but their legal shield was frustratingly solid. They operated under a holding company based in Denver, listing generic venture capital interests. Brenda leaned over my shoulder, squinting at the screen. I clicked through the subsidiary links following the chain of ownership up the corporate ladder. I had written a script to scrape the state business registries, linking the Denver holding company to its parent corporation. The script finished executing. The screen flashed displaying the name of the parent corporation, Helios Renewables. I froze. The name triggered a sharp memory. I scrambled through the stack of printed documents on my table, digging out the original file Thomas had given me regarding the energy leases. I flipped to the final page, scanning the addendum Dale had filed right before he died. The addendum detailed a long-term, highly confidential negotiation Dale had initiated. He was preparing to pivot a large section of the federal mineral leases away from traditional oil extraction and transition them into a massive wind and solar grid project. The partner he was secretly negotiating this green energy transition with was listed clearly on the document, Helios Renewables. The plot twist hit me with the force of a physical blow. The predatory loan sharks Wyatt had borrowed from were not some random, faceless cartel. They were a subsidiary of the exact same green energy development firm Grandpa Dale had been secretly partnering with to secure the future of the estate. Wyatt, in his blind panic to buy up the border parcels to stop developers, had unwittingly pledged the ranch's oil leases as collateral to the very corporate entity Dale was already working with. The developers Wyatt thought he was fighting were the same people holding his debt. It was a staggering, tragic loop of miscommunication and irony, but it also gave me a profound tactical advantage. I realized that if Helios Renewables was already negotiating a green energy transition with Dale for those specific federal plats, they would have mapped the terrain extensively. Their internal land surveys for the wind turbines would have to be incredibly precise. I turned to Brenda, the adrenaline spiking in my chest. I asked her if she knew the original historical boundary lines of the federal leases Dale had signed decades ago. I knew the digital coordinates, but I needed the physical historical context of how the fences were actually laid out on the dirt. Brenda frowned, confused by the sudden shift in my energy, but she nodded. She said she knew every inch of that fence line. She had ridden those boundaries on horseback since she was 12 years old. She knew where the old creek beds shifted the property markers and where the federal plats deviated from the modern GPS maps. I pulled up the digital land survey the creditors had submitted as part of their lawsuit, detailing the specific acreage Wyatt had pledged as collateral. I overlaid it with the historical map Brenda described using my software to match the topographical points. The 2 women former enemies stood shoulder to shoulder in a cramped Laramie apartment staring at the glowing monitor. Brenda pointed to a ridgeline on the screen indicating where the old federal lease boundary actually ended, far short of the modern digital marker. I ran a quick calculation comparing the acreage. The mapping discrepancy was undeniable. Wyatt had used an outdated generalized digital plat when he signed the collateral agreement with the Denver subsidiary. He had pledged sections of federal land that did not actually belong to the Carter estate's specific lease authorization. He had promised dirt he did not legally control, and the corporate lawyers for Helios rushing to secure the high-interest debt had failed to verify the historical boundary markers against the federal registry. They failed their due diligence. The collateral claim was geographically invalid. I looked at Brenda, a slow, sharp smile spreading across my face. I finally had the ammunition I needed to tear their lawsuit apart. The creditors thought they had trapped a desperate cowboy and a naive software developer, but they were about to walk into a legal ambush. 6 months dragged by, consumed entirely by the grueling preparation for the corporate lawsuit. The harsh Wyoming winter thawed into a muddy spring and then baked into a dry, dusty summer. I spent those months working closely with Thomas and a team of forensic accountants he hired. I used my software background to build a comprehensive interactive digital map of the estate's historical lease boundaries, integrating the data Brenda had provided. I practically lived in Thomas's office, preparing for the deposition that would decide the fate of the $2 million trust and the energy leases. The day of the deposition arrived in late August. I drove down to Denver with Thomas. The city felt loud and congested compared to the open plains of Laramie. We rode the elevator up to the 40th floor of a towering glass skyscraper, the headquarters of the legal firm representing Helios Renewables and their predatory subsidiary. The conference room was a sterile, intimidating space. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the Denver skyline. The massive table was polished mahogany surrounded by heavy leather chairs. The air conditioning was turned up too high, making the room feel like a meat locker. I took my seat next to Thomas. My palms were sweating, leaving damp prints on the sleek surface of the table. I wiped them discreetly on my slacks. Wyatt was already there. He sat at the far end of the table, flanked by a court-appointed public defender. He looked entirely hollowed out. The arrogant outfitter who wore custom boots and mocked my career was gone. He wore a cheap, ill-fitting suit that hung loose on his frame. He had lost weight. He kept his eyes fixed on his hands folded tightly in his lap, refusing to look in my direction. The double doors opened, and the legal team for the creditors walked in. There were 4 of them dressed in sharp, expensive suits carrying thick briefcases. The lead attorney was a man named Vance, tall and imposing with a predatory sharpness to his movements. He did not offer a handshake. He sat down directly across from me, opened his files, and immediately started the recording device. The deposition began with a relentless, aggressive barrage of questions. Vance fired off financial jargon citing specific clauses of the Uniform Commercial Code and complex federal lending statutes. He tried to corner me, treating me like an ignorant relative who had stumbled into a boardroom by accident. He repeatedly emphasized that Wyatt was the acting executor at the time the loan was signed, arguing that the estate was irrevocably bound by his signature. I stuttered initially. The sheer volume of legal terminology overwhelmed me. My voice cracked when I tried to answer his first question regarding the fiduciary timeline. I felt a hot flush of embarrassment climb my neck. I was entirely out of my depth in this arena of corporate sharks, and Vance knew it. He smiled a thin, patronizing curve of his lips, sensing weakness. He slid a copy of the loan agreement across the table. He pointed a manicured finger at the addendum listing the federal energy leases as collateral. He asked me, his tone dripping with condescension, if I denied that the signature on the document belonged to the legal representative of the Carter estate at that specific date and time. I stared at the paper. I took a slow, deep breath, forcing the panic down. I remembered what Thomas had told me in his office months ago. This was just another system. It was data and boundaries. I was a software engineer. I built structures and I knew how to dismantle them. I reached into my bag and pulled out my laptop. I set it on the table and powered it up. I did not try to match his legal jargon. I shifted the battlefield to my territory. I asked the court reporter to connect my laptop to the large presentation screen mounted on the wall behind Vance. The screen flickered to life, displaying a high-resolution interactive geographical map of the Laramie Plains. Vance frowned, his patronizing smile faltering. He asked what relevance a map had to a signed financial contract. I found my footing. My voice steadied the nervous stutter vanishing as I focused on the code I had written. I explained that the relevance lay in the physical dirt his client claimed to own. I clicked a button on my keyboard. A red grid overlay appeared on the screen detailing the specific acreage Wyatt had pledged as collateral, according to the digital coordinates listed in their loan addendum. I then clicked a second button. A blue grid overlay appeared mapping the historical legal boundaries of the federal energy leases assigned to the Carter Generation Skipping Trust using decades-old topographical surveys verified by the Bureau of Land Management. The 2 grids did not match. The red grid extended significantly further west, overlapping onto federal protected land that the Carter estate had never legally possessed. I looked directly at Vance. I explained that when his client accepted the collateral pledge from Wyatt, they relied on generalized, spoofed digital coordinates provided by Wyatt's shadow broker. They did not verify the physical historical boundary markers against the federal registry. I stated clearly, my voice carrying across the silent conference room, that Wyatt had pledged federal land that fell outside the legal boundaries of the trust's authorization. He promised dirt he did not own. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the mahogany table. I told Vance that because his client failed their fundamental due diligence by accepting invalid coordinates for collateral, the lien against the Carter estate was geographically and legally void. I let the silence hang in the freezing room. The corporate lawyers stared at the screen. Vance's face remained rigid, but the subtle tightening of his jaw betrayed his realization. The brilliant, high-priced legal team had been outmaneuvered by a software developer using topographical data. They were legally checkmated. I delivered the final blow. I stated that because the collateral claim against the estate was invalid, the estate owed them absolutely nothing. The $800,000 debt did not belong to the Carter Trust. It belonged solely to the individual who signed the fraudulent contract. It belonged to Wyatt personally. I turned my head and looked down the table at my cousin. Wyatt was staring at the presentation screen, his mouth slightly open. The realization of what had just happened washed over his pale face. I had brilliantly saved the family ranch and the $2 million trust from corporate seizure. The legacy was secure, but in doing so, I had severed the debt from the estate and dropped the entire $800,000 burden squarely onto Wyatt's shoulders. Without the estate's assets to back him up, he had no way to pay it. I had simultaneously rescued the family and cemented his personal financial ruin. Wyatt lowered his head, burying his face in his hands. The fight was over. He would have to declare bankruptcy, lose his outfitting business, and face the full wrath of the predatory lenders without the shield of the Carter name. The deposition concluded shortly after. Vance packed his briefcase in tight, angry silence. The corporate threat was neutralized. I walked out of the towering glass building and stepped onto the bustling Denver street. The crisp mountain air hit my face, clean and sharp. My ribs still carried a faint, dull ache from the fight in the server room months ago, a physical reminder of the brutal conflict. But as I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the cool air, I felt a genuine, profound sense of relief. The crushing weight I had carried since the will reading in Cheyenne finally lifted. I had protected the legacy, but the legal victory did not erase the messy, complicated reality of my family, and I still had to figure out what to do with the cousin I had just bankrupted. 2 weeks after the Denver deposition, the Wyoming probate court issued its final ruling. The judge formally validated the Generation Skipping Trust. The heavy legal cloud lifted, granting me total, uncontested control over the $2 million and the federal energy leases. The Carter legacy was officially secure, fortified by the very digital boundaries Wyatt had tried to exploit. The consequences for my cousin arrived swiftly. Stripped of the estate's financial shield, Wyatt formally declared bankruptcy. The Jackson Hole outfitting business, his custom trucks, the ski chalet he had bragged about at the will, reading all of it, was liquidated by the court to appease his creditors. Furthermore, because I had surrendered the summarized forensic logs linking him to the spoofed IP addresses, the federal prosecutor moved forward with the wire fraud charges. I did not attend his sentencing hearing in Cheyenne. Thomas went in my place, observing from the back row. Thomas called me later that afternoon to relay the verdict. Because Wyatt was a first-time offender, and because the actual financial damage to the estate was intercepted before completion, the federal judge showed leniency. Wyatt avoided a 10-year mandatory minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary. Instead, he was sentenced to 5 years of strict federal probation, heavy financial restitution, and 1,000 hours of mandatory community service. It was a staggering fall from grace, but it kept him out of a cage. I arranged to meet Wyatt one last time before I returned to my software job. I chose a small, rundown diner on the edge of Laramie, far away from the polished law offices and corporate boardrooms where our war had been waged. I arrived early and took a booth by the window. The diner smelled like old grease and burnt coffee. It was quiet, just a few truckers eating breakfast in the corner. Wyatt walked in 10 minutes later. He looked worse than he had at the deposition. The stress of the bankruptcy and the federal sentencing had aged him a decade. He wore a faded flannel shirt and work jeans, the expensive custom leather boots replaced by cheap, scuffed work boots. He moved with a heavy, defeated slump, sliding into the booth across from me without making eye contact. We sat in silence for a long time. The waitress dropped off 2 mugs of black coffee and walked away without taking an order. Neither of us touched the mugs. The conversation was not polished. There were no dramatic apologies or sweeping declarations of forgiveness. It was a somber, awkward exchange between 2 people who shared blood but felt like strangers. Wyatt finally spoke, his voice a low, raspy murmur. He stared at the Formica table and said he was sorry. He said he had ruined his own life trying to be the man he thought Dale wanted him to be. He admitted his desperation made him toxic, and he acknowledged the massive damage he had caused the family. I listened to him, feeling the familiar spike of resentment flare in my chest. I remembered the humiliation at the will reading. I remembered the terror of the Blizzard Drive, the bruising fight in the server room, the exhausting months of corporate litigation. I had every right to hate him, to revel in his destruction, to walk out of that diner and never speak to him again. Instead, I reached into my coat pocket. I pulled out a plain white envelope and slid it across the table toward him. Wyatt stared at the envelope, confused. He hesitated, then reached out with trembling fingers and opened the flap. He pulled out a cashier's check. It was not a check for millions of dollars from the estate accounts. I would never risk the trust's capital on him again. It was a check for $15,000 drawn entirely from my personal savings accumulated from my salary as a software developer over the past 4 years. Wyatt looked at the number, his brow furrowing. He looked up at me, his eyes wide and wet. He asked what this was for. I kept my voice steady, though my throat felt thick and tight. I told him it was to pay the retainer for his federal probation lawyer and to help him cover his basic living expenses for the next few months while he found a real job. Wyatt shook his head, pushing the check back across the table. He said he could not take my money after everything he had done to me. He said he did not deserve it. I stopped his hand, pushing the check firmly back into his palm. I did not smile. I did not offer absolution. I told him I was not giving him the money because we were family. I was not doing it because I forgave him for mocking me or for trying to steal my grandfather's legacy. I told him I was giving him the money because carrying hatred is too exhausting for me to sustain. I explained that if I watched him sink into total destitution, if I let the bitterness consume me, I would become exactly like Aunt Brenda, trapped in a self-inflicted prison of resentment. I needed to cut the emotional tether, and this check was the severance. It was a complex, bitter mercy designed to free me, not him. Wyatt stared at the check, his hand shaking. A tear spilled over his lower lash line, tracking through the dust on his cheek. He folded the paper carefully and put it in his shirt pocket. He could not look me in the eye. He thanked me in a cracked, broken whisper. I stood up, threw a $5 bill on the table for the coffees we never drank, and walked out of the diner. The freezing air hit my face clean and sharp, washing away the smell of the greasy kitchen. I felt a profound lightness settle into my bones. The war was over, and I was finally walking away. But the legal system had one final unexpected twist in store for Wyatt, delivering a dose of poetic justice that no one saw coming. During his sentencing hearing, the federal judge had reviewed the details of Wyatt's crimes. The judge noted that Wyatt had attempted to steal and destroy the physical and digital infrastructure of a working Wyoming ranch. Therefore, the judge decided that his mandatory community service should reflect the nature of his offense. The judge ordered Wyatt to complete his 1,000 hours of manual labor working on an approved agricultural property. Thomas had quietly submitted the Carter Ranch as a sponsored location for the probation program, and the judge had approved it. The man who had worn custom boots and swaggered through law offices expecting to inherit a multi-million-dollar empire was now legally mandated to repair the very property he tried to ruin. He was ordered to mend fences in the freezing wind, shovel out the barns, and clear the irrigation ditches. And the terms of his probation dictated that his hours had to be logged and verified by the legal owners of the property. He had to report directly to Aunt Brenda and to me. Does true justice require punishing someone to the maximum extent of the law, stripping them of everything? Or does it mean knowing when to show a bitter mercy that forces them to rebuild the very thing they tried to break? A full year slipped past, settling the dust of the legal battles. The relentless, punishing Wyoming winter eventually broke, surrendering to a muddy, chaotic spring. The frozen earth thawed, turning the dirt roads leading to the ranch into deep, impassable ruts. It was a difficult transition, messy and unpredictable, mirroring the slow thaw of the trauma that had gripped our family. But underneath the mud, the ground was fertile, ready to support new growth. I kept my apartment in Laramie and retained my position as a software developer at the logistics firm. The routine provided a grounding stability I desperately needed. However, my weekends belonged to the ranch. I used the operational capital from the trust to modernize the estate's infrastructure. I wrote custom software to automate the irrigation systems, integrating weather data to optimize water distribution across the arid pastures. I installed digital sensors on the feed silos to track inventory levels in real time, streamlining the purchasing process. I brought the Carter legacy into the 21st century, replacing Dale's disorganized, paranoid ledger books with secure, efficient code. Brenda and I found a way to coexist. It was not a perfect cinematic reconciliation. We did not suddenly become best friends who shared secrets over morning coffee. We were two stubborn women carrying deep historical resentments. We still bickered frequently. She criticized my reliance on digital screens, arguing that cattle do not care about algorithms. I criticized her refusal to delegate manual labor, pointing out that she was working herself to the bone out of pure stubbornness. But beneath the friction, a quiet, grudging respect began to take root. She saw that I was not trying to sell the land out from under her, and I saw that she was fiercely dedicated to protecting the herd. We were operating on different frequencies, but we were finally pulling in the same direction. One Saturday in late April, the tension broke during the annual calf tagging. The branding pens were a chaotic mess of mud-balling calves and shouting ranch hands. The air smelled of wet dirt, livestock, and burnt hair. Brenda was in the center of the pen, moving with practiced efficiency, directing the hands as they separated the herd. I stood on the outer fence line holding a clipboard, trying to digitally log the tag numbers into my tablet. A massive, agitated Hereford calf broke away from the holding chute, slipping past a ranch hand. It bolted straight toward the fence where I was standing, kicking up thick clumps of mud. Brenda yelled at me to head it off. I panicked. I do not wrangle cattle. I write code. But instinct took over. I dropped my tablet into the dirt, threw my arms out wide, and stepped directly into the calf's path. The animal did not stop. It tried to dart around me. I lunged to block it, my boots losing traction in the slick, ankle-deep mud. I went down hard, landing flat on my back in the muck, sliding 2 feet before coming to a stop. The calf scrambled over my legs and trotted back toward the center of the pen, entirely unbothered. I lay in the mud, staring up at the gray sky, covered in freezing grime from head to toe. I expected Brenda to yell, to mock my clumsiness, to remind me that I did not belong in the dirt. Instead, I heard a strange, unfamiliar sound. Brenda was laughing. It was not a cruel, sarcastic chuckle. It was a loud, genuine belly laugh that echoed across the holding pens. She walked over her boots, sinking into the mud, and offered me her hand. I looked at her, seeing the deep lines around her eyes soften with actual amusement. I could not help it. I started laughing too. The sheer absurdity of the situation, the city girl covered in mud while trying to stop a runaway cow, shattered the remaining tension between us. I grabbed her hand. She hauled me to my feet with surprising strength. She patted my mud-caked shoulder, told me I was useless in a pen, and told me to go clean up before I caught pneumonia. The words were harsh, but her tone was warm. It was a grounding, imperfect moment of connection, solidifying the fragile peace we had built. In May, I made my first major independent decision as the sole trustee of the estate's liquid capital. I did not buy a luxury car or a ski chalet. I used a portion of the operational funds to establish a specialized tech education initiative in Laramie. I partnered with the local high schools, creating a program designed to teach coding, data analytics, and agricultural software integration to young girls living in rural ranching communities. I named the fund after my grandfather, the Dale Carter Innovation Grant. It was a deliberate choice to honor the man who, despite his flaws, recognized the value of my intellect over my ability to swing a hammer. He believed the code controlled the future, and I wanted to ensure other girls in Wyoming had the tools to build that future without having to flee the state to find respect. I stood on the wrap-around porch of the main ranch house one evening in early June. The air was finally turning warm, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. The sun was setting behind the jagged peaks of the Wind River Range, casting long, spectacular shadows across the sprawling basin. I leaned against the wooden railing holding a mug of coffee, watching the sky turn a brilliant fiery orange. The emotional scars were still there. They had not magically vanished. I still missed my father, fiercely wishing he could see that I had not abandoned our roots, but had found a different way to tend them. I still struggled with the memory of Dale's chaotic, secretive methods. I resented the dangerous puzzle he left me, the panic of the ticking clock and the violent confrontation with Wyatt. But standing on that porch surveying the modernized, secure estate, I finally understood why he did it. He knew that if he simply handed me the money and the power, Brenda and Wyatt would have destroyed me in court. They would have challenged my competence, buried me in litigation, and drained the estate fighting over the pieces. Dale forced me into a corner where my only option was to fight for my own strength. He made me prove to myself and to the law that I had the intellect and the grit to protect the legacy. He did not give me the empire. He forced me to earn it. My phone vibrated in my pocket, pulling me from my thoughts. I pulled it out and checked the screen. The notification was an email from the United States Patent and Trademark Office. I opened the message, my heart skipping a beat. The custom software system I had developed to map and optimize the ranch's water management and feed distribution had passed the final review phase. The federal patent was officially approved, registered solely under my name. The foundation of my life, both personal and professional, was finally stable. I had secured the family trust, forged a working peace with my aunt, and established my own intellectual property. The bitter war was truly over, and I was ready to settle into the quiet, steady rhythm of building a future. But the legal and corporate machinations set in motion months ago were not quite finished, and a stunning revelation was waiting for me at the end of the summer, a twist that would completely redefine the scope of my grandfather's chaotic genius. It was late July, and the heat radiating off the dirt arena at Cheyenne Frontier Days was relentless. The world's largest outdoor rodeo is a spectacle of swirling dust-worn leather and roaring crowds. Brenda and I sat high up in the aluminum grandstands, shielding our eyes from the harsh afternoon sun. We were sharing a paper plate of powdered funnel cake, a rare indulgence she had insisted on buying when we walked through the main gates. Down in the dirt, a rider was fighting to hold on to a bucking bull, the crowd erupting with every brutal second that ticked by on the digital display. Brenda cheered loudly, waving her battered cowboy hat in her free hand. We were not a picture-perfect family, but sitting there under the vast Wyoming sky, the peace between us felt solid and earned. The harsh winter of our legal war felt like a distant, faded memory. I spotted a man in a crisp navy suit pushing his way up the crowded bleacher stairs. He looked entirely out of place amidst the endless sea of denim boots and silver belt buckles. It was Thomas. He carried a sleek leather messenger bag tight against his side, his face flushed from the brutal heat and the steep climb. He caught my eye and waved, squeezing past a group of teenagers to reach our row. I stood up, wiping powdered sugar from my hands, feeling a sudden sharp spike of anxiety. Lawyers do not track you down at a summer festival on a Saturday afternoon unless a crisis is unfolding. I asked him if Wyatt had filed some kind of appeal or if the bankruptcy court was calling. Thomas shook his head, catching his breath as he leaned against the metal railing. He told us Wyatt was currently painting miles of wooden fencing on the south pasture, fulfilling his court-mandated community service hours without a single complaint. Thomas said he came out here because he had received a secure package from the Federal Energy Commission, and the contents were too important to wait until Monday morning. We moved away from the loud, chaotic grandstands, finding a quiet spot under the deep shade of the vendor awnings near the livestock pens. Thomas unzipped his bag and pulled out a thick-bound folder. He reminded me of the cryptographic key I had unlocked on the USB drive all those months ago in my Laramie apartment. He said the $2 million in operational capital was only the front-facing layer of Dale's digital vault. There was a secondary data partition hidden deep in the code, designed to trigger only after the probate court validated the trust and the federal energy leases were officially secured under my name. Thomas opened the folder and showed me the finalized partnership agreement Dale had signed with Helios Renewables. He explained that a sweeping new federal grid initiative had just passed in Washington, heavily subsidizing the transition of legacy oil and gas leases into advanced wind and solar sectors. Because Dale had locked in our property coordinates early, anticipating this exact government pivot, our specific federal leases were now the critical anchor point for the entire regional power grid. Thomas pointed to a highlighted figure on the last page of the document. He said the $2 million I fought so hard to protect was just pocket change designed to keep the cattle fed during the transition. The back-end equity of the Carter Energy portfolio, backed by the new federal subsidies and the operational wind farms, was now valued at over $15 million. I stopped breathing. I stared at the numbers printed on the crisp white paper. 15 million. Generational wealth. It was enough to secure the ranch, the herd, and our family line for the next century without ever relying on predatory loans or struggling through a harsh winter. Brenda leaned over my shoulder, reading the figures for herself. She let out a low, stunned whistle. She did not look angry. She did not look resentful that I was the one holding the paper. She looked at me with a profound, quiet awe. She finally understood the full scope of what her father had been building behind closed doors. Thomas was not finished. He reached into his leather bag and pulled out a second envelope, this one bearing the sleek corporate logo of Helios Renewables. He handed it to me. He said the executive board at Helios had reviewed the custom topographical software I built during the Denver deposition to invalidate their own subsidiary's predatory loan. They saw how I seamlessly integrated historical federal plats with modern GPS mapping to expose the flawed collateral claim. Thomas told me they were building a sprawling regional data center in Cheyenne to manage the new green energy grid. They needed a lead software architect who understood both digital infrastructure and Wyoming land rights. They did not want a corporate outsider from the coast. They wanted the local developer who had legally checkmated their own high-priced legal team. They were offering me the position along with a significant equity stake in the grid development project. I held the offer letter in my hands, feeling the heavy cardstock beneath my fingertips. For my entire life, my family had treated my career as a joke. They called me the city girl. They mocked me for staring at computer screens instead of shoveling dirt and fixing fences. But my grandfather had seen the horizon long before anyone else. He knew the era of brute force ranching was evolving. He knew the future required someone who could build digital fences to protect the physical ones. My software engineering, the very skill that made me an outcast in my own home, was the exact tool required to unlock and secure our empire. I did not just survive their greed. I proved I had the intellect and the integrity to elevate the legacy. I looked out over the dusty rodeo grounds, watching the crowds of people moving through the golden afternoon light. Family is a complicated, dangerous thing. We are taught to endure toxic behavior simply because we share blood. We are conditioned to stay quiet, to accept the roles assigned to us by people who refuse to see our true potential, and to shrink ourselves to make others comfortable. But endurance is not a virtue when it costs you your dignity. Setting boundaries is the hardest work you will ever do. It requires walking away from the table when they refuse to respect your seat. It requires trusting your own mind when everyone around you is calling you foolish. I had to rip my family apart to save the foundation. I had to put my own cousin in ruins to protect the dirt he tried to steal. It was ugly, and it hurt, and it cost me sleepless nights, but it was necessary. You do not have to inherit their limitations. You can write your own code. You can redefine the parameters of your life, and you can demand that people meet you on your terms or not at all. You earn your place in this world by standing firm, whether that place is in the mud of a cattle pen or in the architecture of a digital grid. You are the only one who gets to determine your value. Thank you for listening to my story. If you found some strength in these words, hit the subscribe button and stay tuned to this channel. Keep building your future and never let anyone tell you that your skills are worthless. Take care of yourselves, and I will see you in the next one.